Hi, ComD students. All right, as promised, this is the part that discusses tongue movements. And again, you have the information in your textbook. And here I'm just simply explaining it. It doesn't offer you much new information other than basically what's on the slides, what's in the textbook. So we have discussed the different movements of the tongue in context of the extrinsic muscles and context of the intrinsic muscles of the tongue. So, but now we kind of put them together into one in terms of one each function. So you can find them in one place. For tongue tip depression, we understand tongue tip depression is a function of the inferior longitudinal muscle. It contracts and it brings down the tongue tip. And the one that does the opposite is the superior longitudinal. It contracts and lifts up the tongue tip. For tongue tip deviation to the right, you are going to need three muscles. Number one, spontaneous contraction at once of these three muscles. The right side of actually two muscles, the right side of the superior longitudinal and the right side of the inferior longitudinal. Contracts, it's going to deviate the tongue to the right side. If you want to deviate the tongue to the left side, you just do the opposite. You contract the left side or the left portions of the inferior longitudinal and the superior longitudinal. And that contracts and it's going to deviate the tongue to the left. We do these functions when we do oral facial mechanism exams. So lateral margin relaxation, as when you produce you want to put pressure on the tongue tip, press it against the alveolar ridge, but you want the sides of the tongue to be relaxed. So the muscle that contributes to this is the genioglossus, especially also the superior longitudinal muscle and the transverse muscle. Transverse. So for tongue narrowing, we studied this before. We said that the transverse, if you contract, the transverse, when you contract it, you narrow the tongue. And as a result of redistributing the tissue, the tongue is going to be bulkier, will be thicker, and will be protruded forward. So it will become longer and thicker. If you want to do wholesale, like medial tongue depression, like when you say for example, the whole tongue is like kind of actually depression, just bringing the tongue down and also grooving slightly, down and grooving slightly. So you need contraction of the genioglossus and the vertical lingual muscle. Vertical is the one that makes the tongue thinner. When you contract it, makes it thinner and then flatter and spread out. So that contributes to depressing the tongue and to grooving it. But again, different portions of the genioglossus are needed for different functions. For this movement here, the entire genioglossus is involved in bringing the tongue down. For moderate central grooving of the tongue, like a little groove, as you could see, for example, in the first image on the left, first top image on the left, there's a little grooving of the tongue, and trying to get the cursor, little grooving of the tongue in conjunction with the other movement. So here, sorry, the mouse is in this, for example, in the middle picture here, there is depression and tongue slight grooving. You do more if you produce certain sounds like like for example. So for moderate grooving involves the genioglossus and, to a lesser degree, the vertical muscle. As I mentioned, the vertical is going to flatten the tongue, and in order to groove, it means you are actually expanding the surface of the tongue. So where do you get the tissue to expand it? It is by contracting the vertical to make it thinner, and then it's going to give you more tissue to spread for the grooving part. Tongue protrusion, when you push your tongue between the teeth, here, that is protrusion. Beyond bringing the tongue down, or like this, up or down. So tongue protrusion, posterior portion of the genioglossus is needed for little protrusion. So there's the distinction between little protrusion. For example, when you say thumb, theta, bass, the interdental sounds require that little protrusion. But if you want to bring your tongue out to try to touch your chin, for example, that is full protrusion. So the posterior part or segment of the genioglossus is involved. It performs that function by itself for the interdental sounds, th and the. Transverse and vertical muscles are needed. In addition to the genioglossus, the transverse muscle vertical are needed for full protrusion. The transverse is going to narrow the tongue to bring it forward. The vertical will do the best to kind of, if you want to flatten the tongue, then you are going to also contract the vertical simultaneously to make it thinner, and it gives you that spreading. But you have to do the three of them at once to produce the flattening and protrusion as well. Protrusion with elevation and depression like this or like this, it requires the inferior and the superior longitudinal muscles. So that is in addition to the genioglossus. Tongue retraction is going to require, and we bring the tongue back, that's going to require the anterior portion of the genioglossus, first part here, because you want to bring the tongue inward. And this muscle draws the tongue into the oral cavity. And at the same time, you have contraction, simultaneous contraction of the superior and inferior longitudinal muscles. So this will bring the tongue back. The styloglossus will be needed to draw the tongue back for swallowing and for saying, for example, ooh, it contributes to that. Or when you say, the styloglossus. When you elevate the tongue and pull it back for ooh or oh, and also for elevating, for swallowing purposes. Sorry, the system is a little bit slow here. All right. So the posterior, for posterior tongue elevation, to elevate the back portion of the tongue, you need to have the palatoglossus, because you also need the transverse muscle. So glossus is, now, is the anterior wall of the facial pillars. So it is shaped like a half a circle on each side. On the top, it is attached to the palatal aponeurosis. It originates, it has an attachment, and then it attaches to the posterior part of the tongue on the sides. So the lateral posterior segments of the tongue. So you can, if you fixate the lower attachment, you can bring the velum down to depress the velum. If you fixate the top attachment in the velum, then you can elevate the tongue. So it does dual functions. But to bring the tongue, to elevate the back of the tongue, for example, like when you say or ka, ga, then you need the palatoglossus to elevate that part. And you also need the transverse muscle to bunch up the posterior part of the tongue. So the body of the tongue basically is the medial portion of it. Sometimes you call it the dorsum of the tongue. So dorsum. So contract it, if you want to depress that medial part of the tongue here, the dorsum, then you are gonna require the entire genioglossus again, and that is going to depress the medial part of the tongue. You can see the whole tongue is sitting on the genioglossus. The hyoglossus depresses the posterior sides of the tongue, and the hyoglossus includes one segment of it. It's called the chondroglossus segment. So again, it is hard to identify, but I meant for you to look for, but it has, the hyoglossus has, one is the chondroglossus. So don't worry, just worry about the hyoglossus. So these were the dubs that we didn't discuss in class. I'm going to skip over this because ankyloglossia, we discussed it in class. I want the video to be short. And we discussed the retruded mandible and prognathic mandible. In terms of neurological conditions affecting speech, when you say neurogenic, it means things that happen in the brain, like a stroke, for example, or someone having a traumatic brain injury, for example, that can cause damage to areas of communication in the brain. So dysarthria is a muscular disorder. It affects multiple systems in the motor system, where the muscles are not receiving the signals and they're not responding well. So some person might have like paralysis or hemiparesis or weakness. In some cases, they have muscular rigidity. So there are 8 different kinds of dysarthria. And the dysarthria affects breathing, and it affects speech production because you need to have the air supply. And the person, when the person speaks, they wouldn't have enough air supply to raise their voice enough to vary pitch and to vary loudness. And that's going to make their speech robotic and weak. So in any case, it will have an effect on respiration, phonation, and articulation. But the idea of this is that it results from neural damage to lower motor neurons or upper motor neurons. Upper motor neurons are the ones that connect the cortex to the brainstem and the spinal cord. That is within the central nervous system, brainstem and spinal cord. These nerves, the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves and the extensions, so these are part of the lower motor neuron system, basically the peripheral system. So flaccid dysarthria is that kind of dysarthria that's characterized by hypotone, by weak movement, slow, but there is no rigidity in that. It's from damage to the lower motor neurons, which means the spinal neurons and the cranial nerves that activate muscles of the face, for example, and vocal folds and so on. It causes focal damage. Focal means focused. The damage is focused in one particular area. For example, one person might just have one nerve dysfunction and affect the areas on the muscles that the nerve is communicating with. So then we have spastic dysarthria and we have hyperkinetic. Spastic, from spasticity, means like kind of rigidity. It is an upper motor neuron system, and the upper motor neurons in the frontal cortex and the brain stem and spinal cord, these, especially the ones in the brain, in the core, and inside of the frontal lobe of the brain, in the motor planning systems, in the premotor, the premotor cortex, the cortex, and so on. These they give you the fine tuning of the movement. They give you the muscle tone, for example. And they also regulate gross motor as well. So the effect is bigger, is broader, because you have one little area here, for example, the motor strip, and it is communicating with so many areas below. For example, one little segment that is like similar to the size of the segment of a finger tip, for example, controls a big part of your body. And the part that controls all your facial muscles and movement, your neck movement, your for example, vocal folds, all of this is just in the lower 1/3 of that little area of the motor cortex. Very, very small. But when that is extensively connected with all these organs. So when you have the source, damage in the source, it is going to have a broader damage in the lower areas. The spastic dysarthria results in slower articulation, slower movements, and that is because of loss of control, and also there's excessive muscular tone, means muscular tension. Hyperkinetic is caused by upper motor neuron. It is caused by basal ganglia, damage to the basal ganglia, and it is characterized by muscular rigidity as well. The person has a reduced range of articulation. Like you want to say, ooh, ooh, they might not be able to lift up the tongue that high. That makes the range of motion decreased. If you want me to make a big circle, I'm gonna make a small circle. That's the reduced range of motion. Ask me to flex my arm, I might flex up to this, not to this. So limited range of motion. ROM is known as range of motion. If the cerebellum is involved, the patient will have difficulty coordinating movements of multiple articulators. So if you have them say pa 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 pa, patika 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 patika, they would have difficulty coordinating that. This simply because the cerebellum gives us feedback. The cerebellum it coordinates muscle function by being able to have a copy of the plan of what you want to do. It also has direct access to the muscles as they are working, and it compares what the muscle is doing on the ground to what the plan is, what you want to do, and then it finds any mismatches, and it points them to the brain to say there is something wrong. What you want is not produced by the muscles, so it gives you feedback so you can correct the movement while the movement is ongoing. So you have here's the cerebellum, and you have the basal ganglia, for example, here, and they are in the core of the brain, and they are important for motor functions, motor regulation, and for language, and for emotions. So these areas here that you see on the brain, this is the frontal lobe. The posterior part of the frontal lobe here, this red mountain, if you we call it sulcus. That area is your motor cortex. And behind it, that is part of the parietal lobe, is the sensory cortex or the somatosensory cortex. This is a map of all your body that gives you sensation from all different parts of your body. This is a map, your motor map, that controls the different segments of your that move, that you can move voluntarily. So that's the motor cortex in terms of function. That is the sensory cortex. It gives you sensation. So the lower piece here, the lower part of it, is dedicated to speech processing and face, and the part behind it is dedicated also to face and lips and neck and so on, but to give you sensation from them. So while you are doing something with your lips, for example, you are feeling that at the same time. And you can see how the connections are to the premotor or motor planning, and to the motor system, and to the sensory system. And that is what the basal ganglia do. This is why we say this hyperkinetic dysarthria, if there's damage to the basal ganglia and or the cerebellum, that system is going to be disrupted, and the person's movements are not going to be normal if possible. So that is it. And again, it didn't provide much new information, but hopefully it will serve as a review for you. So thank you.